The Battle of Old Baldy, a comprehensive analysis introduction to the Korean War, often referred to as the Forgotten War, was a significant conflict that took place between 1950 and 1953. It involved the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, with the latter being supported by a United Nations force led by the United States. One of the most intense and strategically important battles of this war was the Battle of Old Baldy. This article aims to provide a comprehensive analysis of the Battle of Old Baldy, covering its background, key events, strategic importance, and aftermath. Background: the Korean War context. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. The United Nations, led by the United States, intervened to support South Korea, leading to a protracted and bloody conflict. The war saw numerous battles, with both sides gaining and losing territory multiple times. The Battle of Old Baldy was one of the many fierce engagements that occurred during this period. The strategic importance of Old Baldy. Old Baldy, officially known as Hill 266, was a strategically significant location due to its elevation and proximity to key supply routes. Control of this hill provided a vantage point that allowed forces to observe and control the surrounding area. The hill's strategic importance made it a focal point for both UN and Chinese forces, leading to several intense battles over its control. The Battle of Old Baldy. Initial engagements. The Battle of Old Baldy took place over several months, with the most intense fighting occurring between June 1952 and March 1953. The initial engagements involved the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, which was tasked with defending the hill against Chinese forces. The Chinese, recognizing the strategic importance of Old Baldy, launched several assaults to capture the hill. Key events. June 1952, the first battle. The first major battle for Old Baldy occurred in June 1952. Chinese forces launched a surprise attack, overwhelming the U.S. defenders. Despite fierce resistance, the U.S. forces were forced to retreat, and the Chinese temporarily gained control of the hill. The U.S. forces quickly regrouped and launched a counterattack, successfully recapturing Old Baldy after several days of intense fighting. July 1952, the second battle. In July 1952, Chinese forces launched another assault on Old Baldy. This battle was even more intense than the first, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The U.S. forces managed to hold their ground, but the battle highlighted the difficulty of maintaining control over the hill. March 1953, the final battle. The final and most significant battle for Old Baldy occurred in March 1953. Chinese forces launched a massive assault, employing artillery and infantry in a coordinated attack. Despite determined resistance, the U.S. forces were eventually forced to retreat, and the Chinese regained control of the hill. This battle marked the end of major fighting for Old Baldy, as the war entered its final stages. Tactics and strategies. The Battle of Old Baldy was characterized by the use of various tactics and strategies by both sides. The Chinese forces employed human wave tactics, overwhelming the U.S. defenders with sheer numbers. They also used artillery and mortar fire to soften the defenses before launching infantry assaults. The U.S. forces, on the other hand, relied on superior firepower and defensive positions to hold off the Chinese attacks. They used artillery, machine guns, and air support to inflict heavy casualties on the advancing Chinese forces. However, the relentless nature of the Chinese assaults eventually wore down the U.S. defenders. Aftermath. Casualties and losses. The Battle of Old Baldy resulted in significant casualties for both sides. The U.S. forces suffered heavy losses, with hundreds of soldiers killed or wounded. The Chinese forces also suffered substantial casualties, with estimates ranging from several hundred to over 1,000 killed. Strategic impact. Despite the heavy losses, the Battle of Old Baldy had a limited strategic impact on the overall course of the Korean War. The hill changed hands multiple times, but neither side was able to gain a decisive advantage. The battle highlighted the difficulty of maintaining control over key terrain in the face of determined opposition. Legacy. The Battle of Old Baldy is remembered as one of the most intense and hard-fought battles of the Korean War. It serves as a testament to the bravery and determination of the soldiers on both sides. The battle also underscores the brutal nature of the Korean War, which often involved fierce fighting for seemingly insignificant pieces of terrain. Conclusion: the Battle of Old Baldy was a significant engagement during the Korean War, characterized by intense fighting and heavy casualties. Although it did not have a decisive impact on the overall course of the war, it highlighted the challenges of warfare in Korea's rugged terrain. The bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers who fought in this battle are a reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of remembering those who served. The Battle of Old Baldy, key strategic decisions and their impact on the Korean War. The Korean War, often referred to as the Forgotten War, was a significant conflict that took place between 1950 and 1953. It was a war that saw the involvement of multiple nations, with the United States and China playing pivotal roles. Among the many battles that occurred during this conflict, the Battle of Old Baldy stands out as a particularly fierce and strategically important engagement. This article delves into the key strategic decisions made during the Battle of Old Baldy, examining their impact on the outcome of the battle and the broader Korean War. Background of the Korean War. The outbreak of war. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. The United Nations, led by the United States, quickly intervened to support South Korea. The war saw a series of back-and-forth battles, with both sides gaining and losing territory. The stalemate. By 1951, the war had reached a stalemate, with both sides entrenched along the 38th parallel. The front lines had stabilized, and neither side was able to make significant gains. It was during this period that the Battle of Old Baldy took place. The Battle of Old Baldy. Overview: location and significance. Old Baldy, officially known as Hill 266, was a strategically important location in the Korean peninsula. It was part of the Iron Triangle, a region that included the cities of Chorwon, Kumwa, and Pyongyang. Control of Old Baldy was crucial for both sides, as it provided a vantage point that overlooked key supply routes and enemy positions. The contenders. The battle for Old Baldy involved the United States Army's 45th Infantry Division and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA. Both sides recognized the strategic importance of the hill and were determined to secure it. Key strategic decisions. Decision 1. The initial assault. Planning and preparation. The first key strategic decision was the planning and preparation for the initial assault on Old Baldy. The U.S. Army recognized the importance of the hill and decided to launch a coordinated attack to seize it. The 45th Infantry Division was tasked with leading the assault, and extensive planning was undertaken to ensure success. Execution. The assault began on June 26, 1952, with a heavy artillery bombardment of Chinese positions on Old Baldy. This was followed by an infantry assault, with U.S. troops advancing up the hill under heavy fire. The initial assault was successful, and U.S. forces managed to capture the hill. Decision 2. The defense of Old Baldy. Fortification and reinforcement. After capturing Old Baldy, the U.S. Army made the strategic decision to fortify and reinforce their positions. Trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire were constructed to defend against potential counterattacks. Additional troops were also brought in to bolster the defense. Challenges. Despite these efforts, the U.S. forces faced significant challenges in holding Old Baldy. The Chinese launched several counterattacks, and the hill changed hands multiple times. The rugged terrain and harsh weather conditions further complicated the defense. Decision 3. The Chinese counteroffensive. Planning and preparation. The Chinese PVA recognized the importance of Old Baldy and planned a counteroffensive to retake the hill. They conducted extensive reconnaissance and gathered intelligence on U.S. positions. The Chinese also stockpiled ammunition and supplies in preparation for the assault. Execution. The Chinese counteroffensive began on July 17, 1952, with a massive artillery barrage followed by a human wave assault. The U.S. forces were caught off guard, and the Chinese managed to retake the hill. The battle was fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides. Decision for the U.S. counterattack. Planning and preparation. Following the loss of Old Baldy, the U.S. Army planned a counterattack to retake the hill. The 45th Infantry Division was once again tasked with leading the assault. Extensive planning was undertaken, including the use of air support and artillery to soften Chinese defenses. Execution. The U.S. counterattack began on July 23, 1952, with a coordinated assault involving infantry, artillery, and air support. The battle was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Despite the challenges, the U.S. forces managed to retake Old Baldy. Decision 5, the final defense fortification and reinforcement. After retaking Old Baldy, the U.S. Army made the strategic decision to further fortify and reinforce their positions. Additional troops were brought in, and defensive structures were strengthened. The U.S. also established a more robust supply line to ensure that their forces on the hill were well supplied. Challenges. The final defense of Old Baldy was marked by continued Chinese counterattacks. The U.S. forces faced constant pressure, and the hill remained a contested area. However, the U.S. was able to hold Old Baldy until the end of the war. Impact of strategic decisions on the battle. Tactical outcomes. The key strategic decisions made during the Battle of Old Baldy had a significant impact on the tactical outcomes of the battle. The initial assault and subsequent counterattacks demonstrated the importance of planning, coordination, and adaptability in military operations. The ability to quickly reinforce and fortify positions was crucial in holding the hill. Casualties and losses. The Battle of Old Baldy was one of the bloodiest engagements of the Korean War. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, with thousands of soldiers killed or wounded. The strategic decisions made during the battle contributed to the high casualty rate, as both sides were determined to secure the hill at any cost. Strategic importance. The Battle of Old Baldy highlighted the strategic importance of controlling key terrain in the Korean War. The hill provided a vantage point that allowed for observation of enemy positions and supply routes. The ability to control Old Baldy gave the U.S. a significant advantage in the broader conflict. Broader impact on the Korean War. Influence on the stalemate. The Battle of Old Baldy was part of the broader stalemate that characterized the Korean War. The back-and-forth nature of the battle reflected the overall stalemate along the 38th parallel. The strategic decisions made during the battle were indicative of the larger strategic challenges faced by both sides in the war. Lessons learned. The Battle of Old Baldy provided valuable lessons for both the U.S. and Chinese forces. The importance of planning, coordination, and adaptability was reinforced. The battle also highlighted the challenges of fighting in rugged terrain and harsh weather conditions. Impact on peace negotiations. The Battle of Old Baldy, along with other engagements during the Korean War, influenced the peace negotiations that eventually led to the armistice in 1953. The high casualties and the inability of either side to achieve a decisive victory contributed to the decision to seek a negotiated settlement. The Battle of Old Baldy was a significant engagement in the Korean War, marked by fierce fighting and key strategic decisions. The initial assault, defense, counteroffensives, and final defense of the hill demonstrated the importance of planning, coordination, and adaptability in military operations. The battle had a significant impact on the tactical and strategic outcomes of the Korean War, influencing the broader stalemate and eventual peace negotiations. The lessons learned from the Battle of Old Baldy continue to resonate in military strategy and operations today. The impact of weather conditions on the outcome of the Battle of Old Baldy. The Battle of Old Baldy, a significant engagement during the Korean War, was fought between United Nations, UN, forces, primarily composed of American and South Korean troops, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA. The battle took place over a series of engagements from 1952 to 1953, centered around Hill 266, known as Old Baldy due to its bare, treeless summit. The strategic importance of Old Baldy lay in its elevation, which provided a vantage point overlooking the surrounding terrain, making it a coveted position for both sides. While the battle is often analyzed in terms of military strategy, troop movements, and political context, one critical factor that significantly influenced the outcome was the weather. The Korean Peninsula's climate, characterized by harsh winters, monsoonal rains, and extreme temperature fluctuations, played a pivotal role in shaping the course of the battle. This article delves into the multifaceted impact of weather conditions on the Battle of Old Baldy, exploring how environmental factors affected troop morale, logistics, combat effectiveness, and ultimately, the battle's outcome. The Korean Peninsula's climate and its challenges. Geographic and climatic overview. The Korean Peninsula, located in East Asia, experiences a temperate climate with 4 distinct seasons. However, the region's weather is heavily influenced by the Siberian high in winter and the East Asian monsoon in summer. These systems bring extreme weather conditions, including frigid winters with heavy snowfall and hot, humid summers with torrential rains. During the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, the peninsula's climate posed significant challenges for both UN and PVA forces. The rugged terrain, combined with the unpredictable weather, created a hostile environment that tested the limits of human endurance and military logistics. Weather patterns during the Battle of Old Baldy. The Battle of Old Baldy occurred over several months, with major engagements taking place in the summer of 1952 and the spring of 1953. During these periods, the weather conditions varied dramatically, impacting the battle in different ways. Summer, June-August 1952, the summer months were characterized by high temperatures, heavy rainfall, and high humidity. The monsoon season brought relentless rains, turning the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and flooding. These conditions made movement difficult, disrupted supply lines, and contributed to the spread of disease among troops. Winter, December 1952 to February 1953, the winter months were marked by extreme cold, with temperatures often dropping below -20 degrees Celsius -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow and ice covered the terrain, making it treacherous for both infantry and vehicles. The cold weather also posed serious risks to soldiers' health, including frostbite and hypothermia. Spring, March-May 1953, the spring months brought a mix of rain and melting snow, leading to muddy conditions similar to those experienced in the summer. However, the temperatures were more moderate, providing some relief from the extreme cold of winter. The impact of weather on troop morale and health. Summer heat, humidity, and disease. The summer weather during the Battle of Old Baldy had a profound impact on troop morale and health. The combination of high temperatures and humidity created an oppressive environment that sapped soldiers' energy and made it difficult to perform even basic tasks. Heat stress. Prolonged exposure to high temperatures led to heat stress, dehydration, and heat stroke among troops. The physical exertion required for combat operations, combined with the lack of adequate hydration, exacerbated these conditions. Disease outbreaks. The monsoon rains created stagnant water pools, which became breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease vectors. As a result, troops on both sides suffered from outbreaks of malaria, dysentery, and other waterborne illnesses. The spread of disease not only reduced the number of effective combatants but also placed additional strain on medical resources. Mud and flooding. The heavy rains turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, making movement difficult and slowing down supply convoys. Soldiers had to contend with flooded trenches, waterlogged equipment, and the constant threat of trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet and unsanitary conditions. Winter cold, snow, and frostbite. The winter weather presented a different set of challenges for the troops engaged in the Battle of Old Baldy. The extreme cold and snow created a harsh environment that tested the limits of human endurance. Frostbite and hypothermia. The sub-zero temperatures posed a serious risk of frostbite and hypothermia. Soldiers had to rely on inadequate winter clothing and equipment, which often failed to provide sufficient protection against the cold. Frostbite, which can lead to the loss of fingers, toes, and even limbs, was a common occurrence among troops on both sides. Snow and ice. The snow and ice-covered terrain made movement difficult and dangerous. Tanks and other vehicles often became stuck in the snow, while infantry had to navigate slippery slopes and frozen ground. The cold weather also affected the performance of weapons and equipment, with firearms jamming and machinery freezing up. Mental health. The prolonged exposure to extreme cold and the isolation of winter conditions took a toll on soldiers' mental health. The lack of sunlight, combined with the constant threat of enemy attacks, contributed to feelings of depression and anxiety among troops. Spring mud and melting snow. The spring weather brought a mix of rain and melting snow, creating muddy conditions similar to those experienced in the summer. While the temperatures were more moderate, the mud and flooding continued to pose significant challenges for both UN and PVA forces. Mud and mobility. The muddy terrain made it difficult for troops to move quickly and efficiently. Supply convoys were often delayed, and the constant struggle to navigate the mud sapped soldiers' energy and morale. Flooding. The melting snow and spring rains led to flooding in many areas, further complicating logistics and troop movements. Flooded trenches and bunkers made it difficult for soldiers to maintain defensive positions, while the risk of landslides added another layer of danger. The impact of weather on logistics and supply lines. Summer monsoons and supply disruptions. The summer monsoon season had a significant impact on the logistics and supply lines of both UN and PVA forces. The heavy rains and flooding disrupted the movement of supplies, making it difficult to maintain a steady flow of food, ammunition, and medical supplies to the front lines. Road conditions. The monsoon rains turned dirt roads into impassable mud pits, making it difficult for supply convoys to reach their destinations. Vehicles often became stuck in the mud, requiring significant effort to free them. In some cases, supply convoys had to be abandoned altogether, leaving troops without essential supplies. Air support. The heavy rains and low visibility also hampered air support operations. Supply drops by air were often delayed or cancelled due to poor weather conditions, further exacerbating the supply shortages on the ground. Flooding. The flooding caused by the monsoon rains damaged bridges and roads, cutting off supply routes and isolating troops. Engineers had to work around the clock to repair damaged infrastructure, but the constant rain made it difficult to make progress. Winter snow and frozen supply lines. The winter weather presented a different set of challenges for logistics and supply lines. The extreme cold and snow made it difficult to transport supplies, while the frozen ground made it difficult to construct and maintain roads and bridges. Frozen roads. The snow and ice-covered roads made it difficult for vehicles to navigate, leading to delays in supply convoys. In some cases, vehicles became stuck in the snow, requiring significant effort to free them. The cold weather also affected the performance of vehicles, with engines freezing up and fuel lines becoming clogged with ice. Air support. The winter weather also hampered air support operations, with snow and ice making it difficult for aircraft to take off and land. Supply drops by air were often delayed or cancelled due to poor weather conditions, further exacerbating the supply shortages on the ground. Frozen equipment. The extreme cold affected the performance of weapons and equipment, with firearms jamming and machinery freezing up. This made it difficult for troops to maintain their equipment and keep it in working order, further complicating logistics and supply operations. Spring mud and flooding. The spring weather brought a mix of rain and melting snow, creating muddy conditions similar to those experienced in the summer. While the temperatures were more moderate, the mud and flooding continued to pose significant challenges for logistics and supply lines. Muddy roads. The muddy terrain made it difficult for supply convoys to move quickly and efficiently. Vehicles often became stuck in the mud, requiring significant effort to free them. In some cases, supply convoys had to be abandoned altogether, leaving troops without essential supplies. Flooding. The melting snow and spring rains led to flooding in many areas, further complicating logistics and troop movements. Flooded roads and bridges made it difficult for supply convoys to reach their destinations, while the risk of landslides added another layer of danger. Air support. The spring weather also hampered air support operations, with rain and low visibility making it difficult for aircraft to take off and land. Supply drops by air were often delayed or cancelled due to poor weather conditions, further exacerbating the supply shortages on the ground. The impact of weather on combat effectiveness. Summer heat, humidity, and combat performance. The summer weather had a significant impact on the combat effectiveness of both UN and PVA forces. The combination of high temperatures, humidity, and disease outbreaks reduced the physical and mental stamina of troops, making it difficult to maintain a high level of combat performance. Physical exhaustion. The oppressive heat and humidity sapped soldiers' energy, making it difficult to perform physically demanding tasks such as marching, digging trenches, and engaging in combat. The constant struggle to stay hydrated and cool added to the physical exhaustion, reducing the overall combat effectiveness of troops. Disease and casualties. The outbreaks of disease caused by the monsoon rains further reduced the number of effective combatants. Soldiers who fell ill were often unable to participate in combat operations, placing additional strain on the remaining troops. The spread of disease also placed a significant burden on medical resources, further reducing the overall combat effectiveness of the forces. Mud and mobility. The muddy terrain made it difficult for troops to move quickly and efficiently, reducing their ability to respond to enemy attacks and carry out offensive operations. The constant struggle to navigate the mud sapped soldiers' energy and morale, further reducing their combat effectiveness. Winter cold, snow, and combat performance. The winter weather presented a different set of challenges for combat effectiveness. The extreme cold and snow reduced the physical and mental stamina of troops, making it difficult to maintain a high level of combat performance. Physical exhaustion. The extreme cold and snow sapped soldiers' energy, making it difficult to perform physically demanding tasks such as marching, digging trenches, and engaging in combat. The constant struggle to stay warm and avoid frostbite added to the physical exhaustion, reducing the overall combat effectiveness of troops' weapon performance. The cold weather affected the performance of weapons and equipment, with firearms jamming and machinery freezing up. This made it difficult for troops to maintain their equipment and keep it in working order, further reducing their combat effectiveness. Mental health. The prolonged exposure to extreme cold and the isolation of winter conditions took a toll on soldiers' mental health. The lack of sunlight, combined with the constant threat of enemy attacks, contributed to feelings of depression and anxiety among troops, further reducing their combat effectiveness. Spring mud and combat performance. The spring weather brought a mix of rain and melting snow, creating muddy conditions similar to those experienced in the summer. While the temperatures were more moderate, the mud and flooding continued to pose significant challenges for combat effectiveness. Physical exhaustion. The muddy terrain made it difficult for troops to move quickly and efficiently, reducing their ability to respond to enemy attacks and carry out offensive operations. The constant struggle to navigate the mud sapped soldiers' energy and morale, further reducing their combat effectiveness. Weapon performance. The muddy conditions affected the performance of weapons and equipment, with firearms jamming and machinery becoming clogged with mud. This made it difficult for troops to maintain their equipment and keep it in working order, further reducing their combat effectiveness. Mental health. The constant struggle to navigate the muddy terrain and the risk of flooding and landslides took a toll on soldiers' mental health. The lack of progress and the constant threat of enemy attacks contributed to feelings of frustration and anxiety among troops, further reducing their combat effectiveness. The strategic impact of weather on the Battle of Old Baldy. Summer monsoons and strategic decisions. The summer monsoon season had a significant impact on the strategic decisions made by both UN and PVA forces during the Battle of Old Baldy. The heavy rains and flooding disrupted supply lines, reduced combat effectiveness, and forced both sides to adapt their strategies to the challenging weather conditions. Defensive posture. The difficult weather conditions forced both sides to adopt a more defensive posture, with troops focusing on holding their positions rather than launching offensive operations. The muddy terrain and flooded trenches made it difficult to carry out large-scale attacks, leading to a stalemate in many areas. Supply shortages. The disruption of supply lines caused by the monsoon rains forced both sides to ration supplies and prioritize essential items such as food, ammunition, and medical supplies. This placed additional strain on troops and reduced their ability to carry out offensive operations. Air support. The poor weather conditions hampered air support operations, reducing the effectiveness of airstrikes and supply drops. This forced both sides to rely more heavily on ground-based logistics, further complicating their strategic decisions. Winter snow and strategic decisions. The winter weather presented a different set of challenges for strategic decision-making during the Battle of Old Baldy. The extreme cold and snow disrupted supply lines, reduced combat effectiveness, and forced both sides to adapt their strategies to the harsh weather conditions. Defensive posture. The extreme cold and snow forced both sides to adopt a more defensive posture, with troops focusing on holding their positions rather than launching offensive operations. The frozen terrain and snow-covered trenches made it difficult to carry out large-scale attacks, leading to a stalemate in many areas. Supply shortages. The disruption of supply lines caused by the winter weather forced both sides to ration supplies and prioritize essential items such as food, ammunition, and medical supplies. This placed additional strain on troops and reduced their ability to carry out offensive operations. Air support. The poor weather conditions hampered air support operations, reducing the effectiveness of airstrikes and supply drops. This forced both sides to rely more heavily on ground-based logistics, further complicating their strategic decisions. Spring mud and strategic decisions. The spring weather brought a mix of rain and melting snow, creating muddy conditions similar to those experienced in the summer. While the temperatures were more moderate, the mud and flooding continued to pose significant challenges for strategic decision-making during the Battle of Old Baldy. Defensive posture. The muddy terrain and flooded trenches forced both sides to adopt a more defensive posture, with troops focusing on holding their positions rather than launching offensive operations. The difficult weather conditions made it challenging to carry out large-scale attacks, leading to a stalemate in many areas. Supply shortages. The disruption of supply lines caused by the spring weather forced both sides to ration supplies and prioritize essential items such as food, ammunition, and medical supplies. This placed additional strain on troops and reduced their ability to carry out offensive operations. Air support. The poor weather conditions hampered air support operations, reducing the effectiveness of airstrikes and supply drops. This forced both sides to rely more heavily on ground-based logistics, further complicating their strategic decisions. The human cost of weather-related challenges, casualties and injuries. The harsh weather conditions during the Battle of Old Baldy contributed to a significant number of casualties and injuries among both UN and PVA forces. The extreme heat, cold, and mud created a hostile environment that tested the limits of human endurance and led to a high number of weather-related injuries. Heat-related injuries. During the summer months, many soldiers suffered from heat stress, dehydration, and heat stroke. These conditions not only reduced the number of effective combatants but also placed a significant burden on medical resources. Cold-related injuries. During the winter months, frostbite and hypothermia were common among troops. The extreme cold led to the loss of fingers, toes, and even limbs, further reducing the number of effective combatants and placing additional strain on medical resources. Mud-related injuries. The muddy terrain during the spring and summer months led to a high number of injuries related to slips, falls, and trench foot. These injuries reduced the combat effectiveness of troops and placed additional strain on medical resources. Psychological impact. The harsh weather conditions also had a significant psychological impact on the troops engaged in the Battle of Old Baldy. The constant struggle to cope with the extreme heat, cold, and mud took a toll on soldiers' mental health, leading to feelings of frustration, anxiety, and depression. Isolation and loneliness. The harsh weather conditions often isolated troops from their comrades and support networks, leading to feelings of loneliness and isolation. The lack of sunlight during the winter months further exacerbated these feelings, contributing to a decline in mental health. Stress and anxiety. The constant threat of enemy attacks, combined with the harsh weather conditions, created a high-stress environment that took a toll on soldiers' mental health. The uncertainty and unpredictability of the weather added to the stress and anxiety experienced by troops. Depression. The prolonged exposure to extreme weather conditions and the constant struggle to cope with the challenges of the battlefield led to feelings of depression among many soldiers. The lack of progress and the high number of casualties further contributed to a decline in morale and mental health. The role of weather in the final outcome of the Battle of Old Baldy. The stalemate and ceasefire. The Battle of Old Baldy ultimately ended in a stalemate, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. The harsh weather conditions played a significant role in this outcome, as they disrupted supply lines, reduced combat effectiveness, and forced both sides to adopt a more defensive posture. Supply disruptions. The constant disruption of supply lines caused by the harsh weather conditions made it difficult for both sides to maintain a steady flow of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. This placed additional strain on troops and reduced their ability to carry out offensive operations. Combat effectiveness. The extreme heat, cold, and mud reduced the combat effectiveness of both UN and PVA forces, making it difficult to achieve a decisive victory. The constant struggle to cope with the harsh weather conditions sapped soldiers' energy and morale, further reducing their ability to carry out offensive operations. Defensive posture. The harsh weather conditions forced both sides to adopt a more defensive posture, with troops focusing on holding their positions rather than launching offensive operations. This led to a stalemate in many areas, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. The impact on the Korean War. The stalemate at the Battle of Old Baldy had a significant impact on the broader Korean War. The harsh weather conditions and the resulting stalemate contributed to the overall stalemate that characterized much of the Korean War, leading to the eventual ceasefire in 1953. Negotiations and ceasefire. The stalemate at the Battle of Old Baldy, along with other stalemates across the Korean peninsula, contributed to the decision to negotiate a ceasefire. The harsh weather conditions and the resulting stalemate made it clear that neither side was likely to achieve a decisive victory, leading to the eventual ceasefire in 1953. Legacy of the battle. The Battle of Old Baldy remains a significant event in the history of the Korean War, highlighting the challenges posed by the harsh weather conditions on the Korean peninsula. The battle serves as a reminder of the importance of considering environmental factors in military strategy and the impact of weather on the outcome of conflicts. The Battle of Old Baldy was a significant engagement during the Korean War, with the harsh weather conditions playing a critical role in shaping the outcome. The extreme heat, cold, and mud created a hostile environment that tested the limits of human endurance and disrupted supply lines, reduced combat effectiveness, and forced both sides to adopt a more defensive posture. The resulting stalemate contributed to the broader stalemate that characterized much of the Korean War, leading to the eventual ceasefire in 1953. The impact of weather on the Battle of Old Baldy serves as a reminder of the importance of considering environmental factors in military strategy. The challenges posed by the harsh weather conditions on the Korean peninsula highlight the need for adequate preparation, logistics, and adaptability in the face of unpredictable and extreme weather. The lessons learned from the Battle of Old Baldy continue to resonate in modern military strategy, underscoring the critical role of weather in shaping the outcome of conflicts. The role of air support in the Battle of Old Baldy. The Battle of Old Baldy, a significant engagement during the Korean War, took place between June 1952 and March 1953. This battle was part of the larger conflict between United Nations (UN) forces, primarily composed of American and South Korean troops, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army (PVA) and North Korean forces. The battle was named after Hill 266, known as Old Baldy due to its bare, treeless summit, which was a strategic high ground in the western sector of the Korean peninsula. The fight for Old Baldy was characterized by intense infantry combat, artillery duels, and crucially, the extensive use of air support. This article delves into the pivotal role that air support played in the Battle of Old Baldy, examining its impact on tactical operations, morale, logistics, and the overall outcome of the battle. Historical context. The Korean War. A brief overview. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, was a conflict between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, with the former supported by China and the Soviet Union, and the latter supported by a United Nations coalition led by the United States. The war began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces invaded South Korea, leading to a swift UN response. The conflict saw dramatic shifts in momentum, with initial North Korean advances, a UN counteroffensive that pushed into North Korea, and subsequent Chinese intervention that stabilized the front near the 38th parallel. The strategic importance of Old Baldy. Old Baldy, or Hill 266, was a strategically significant position due to its elevation and location. Control of this hill provided a vantage point over the surrounding terrain, allowing for observation of enemy movements and the ability to direct artillery fire. The hill's capture or loss could influence the balance of power in the region, making it a focal point for both sides. The Battle of Old Baldy. An overview. The phases of the battle. The Battle of Old Baldy can be divided into several phases, each marked by intense fighting and shifting control of the hill. Initial skirmishes. June 1952. The battle began with skirmishes as both sides recognized the strategic value of Old Baldy. The UN forces initially held the hill, but the Chinese launched a series of attacks to dislodge them. Chinese offensives. July-August 1952. The Chinese forces, employing human wave tactics and night assaults, managed to capture Old Baldy. The UN forces, determined to retake the hill, launched counterattacks. Stalemate and trench warfare. September 1952 to February 1953. The battle settled into a stalemate, with both sides digging in and engaging in trench warfare. Artillery and air support became crucial in maintaining positions and harassing the enemy. Final UN counteroffensive. March 1953. The UN forces launched a final, successful counteroffensive to retake Old Baldy, securing the hill before the armistice negotiations concluded. The role of air support. Throughout these phases, air support played a critical role in shaping the battle's outcome. The UN forces, particularly the United States Air Force, USAF, utilized air power to achieve several objectives. Close air support, CAS providing direct support to ground troops by attacking enemy positions, fortifications, and troop concentrations. Interdiction, disrupting enemy supply lines, logistics, and reinforcements by targeting roads, bridges, and supply depots. Reconnaissance, gathering intelligence on enemy movements, positions, and fortifications through aerial observation and photography. Psychological operations, demoralizing enemy troops through relentless bombing and strafing runs. Medical evacuation, evacuating wounded soldiers from the battlefield using helicopters, a relatively new innovation at the time. Close air support, CAS, in the Battle of Old Baldy. Definition and importance of CAS. Close air support, CAS, refers to air operations that provide direct support to ground forces engaged in combat. CAS missions are characterized by their proximity to friendly troops and the need for precise coordination between air and ground units. In the context of the Battle of Old Baldy, CAS was crucial in neutralizing enemy strongpoints, suppressing enemy fire, and providing cover for advancing infantry. CAS missions during the battle: precision strikes on enemy positions, USAF aircraft, including F-80 Shooting Stars, F-84 Thunderjets, and F-86 Sabres, conducted precision strikes on Chinese and North Korean positions on Old Baldy. These strikes targeted bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery emplacements, reducing the enemy's ability to defend the hill. Suppression of enemy fire. CAS missions were often called in to suppress enemy fire during UN assaults on Old Baldy. By targeting enemy mortar and artillery positions, CAS allowed UN infantry to advance with reduced risk. Night operations. The Chinese forces frequently launched night attacks to exploit the cover of darkness. In response, the USAF employed night fighters and flare-dropping aircraft to illuminate the battlefield and provide CAS during these critical moments. Challenges and limitations of CAS. Despite its effectiveness, CAS faced several challenges during the Battle of Old Baldy. Weather conditions. The Korean Peninsula's harsh weather, including fog, rain, and snow, often limited the ability of aircraft to conduct CAS missions. Poor visibility and low cloud ceilings made it difficult for pilots to identify and engage targets accurately. Terrain. The rugged terrain around Old Baldy posed challenges for CAS. Steep slopes, dense vegetation, and the proximity of friendly and enemy forces required precise coordination to avoid fratricide. Enemy anti-aircraft fire. Chinese and North Korean forces deployed anti-aircraft artillery, AAA, and small arms fire to counter CAS missions. While not as sophisticated as later conflicts, these defenses posed a significant threat to low-flying aircraft. Coordination with ground forces. Effective CAS required seamless communication and coordination between air and ground units. However, the fog of war, communication breakdowns, and the rapid pace of battle sometimes led to delays or misdirected strikes. Interdiction campaigns. Disrupting enemy logistics. The importance of interdiction campaigns aimed to disrupt the enemy's ability to sustain its forces by targeting supply lines, logistics hubs, and reinforcements. In the context of the Battle of Old Baldy, interdiction was crucial in weakening the Chinese and North Korean forces' ability to resupply and reinforce their positions on the hill. Key interdiction targets. Roads and bridges. The rugged terrain of Korea made roads and bridges critical for the movement of supplies and troops. USAF aircraft targeted these infrastructure elements to hinder the enemy's logistical capabilities. Supply depots. Chinese and North Korean forces relied on supply depots to store ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Bombing these depots disrupted the flow of essential resources to the front lines. Railways. Railways were a primary means of transporting heavy equipment and large quantities of supplies. Interdiction missions focused on destroying railway lines, bridges, and rolling stock to cripple the enemy's logistics network. Impact of interdiction on the battle. The interdiction campaigns had a significant impact on the Battle of Old Baldy, reduced enemy reinforcements. By targeting roads, bridges, and railways, the USAF limited the enemy's ability to reinforce their positions on Old Baldy. This reduced the number of troops available to defend the hill and counter UN assaults. Supply shortages. The destruction of supply depots and the disruption of supply lines led to shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies for the Chinese and North Korean forces. This weakened their combat effectiveness and morale. Delayed offensives. Interdiction missions delayed enemy offensives by disrupting the movement of troops and supplies. This gave UN forces more time to prepare defenses and launch counterattacks. Reconnaissance. The eyes in the sky. The role of reconnaissance in modern warfare. Reconnaissance, or the gathering of intelligence through observation, is a critical component of modern warfare. In the Korean War, aerial reconnaissance provided UN forces with valuable information about enemy positions, movements, and fortifications. This intelligence was essential for planning operations, directing artillery fire, and coordinating air support. Reconnaissance missions during the battle. Aerial photography. USAF reconnaissance aircraft, such as the RF-80 Shooting Star and RB-26 Invader, conducted aerial photography missions over Old Baldy and the surrounding area. These photographs provided detailed images of enemy positions, allowing UN commanders to identify targets and plan assaults. Visual observation. Pilots and observers in reconnaissance aircraft visually scanned the battlefield for signs of enemy activity. This included spotting troop movements, artillery positions, and supply routes. Electronic intelligence. Some reconnaissance missions involved electronic intelligence, ELINT, gathering, where aircraft detected and located enemy radar and communication signals. This information was used to counter enemy air defenses and disrupt communications. Impact of reconnaissance on the battle. Reconnaissance played a crucial role in the Battle of Old Baldy by providing UN forces with the intelligence needed to make informed decisions. Target identification. Aerial reconnaissance allowed UN forces to identify and prioritize targets for artillery and airstrikes. This increased the effectiveness of these strikes and reduced the risk of collateral damage. Operational planning. The intelligence gathered through reconnaissance missions informed the planning of UN assaults on Old Baldy. Commanders could use this information to identify weak points in the enemy's defenses and plan their attacks accordingly. Situational awareness. Reconnaissance provided UN forces with a better understanding of the battlefield situation. This allowed them to anticipate enemy movements, adjust their tactics, and respond to changing conditions more effectively. Psychological operations. Demoralizing the enemy. The psychological impact of air power. Air power has a profound psychological impact on both friendly and enemy forces. For friendly troops, the presence of air support can boost morale and provide a sense of security. For the enemy, the constant threat of air attacks can lead to fear, stress, and demoralization. In the Battle of Old Baldy, psychological operations, PSYOP, were an integral part of the air campaign. PSYOP tactics employed relentless bombing. The continuous bombing of enemy positions on Old Baldy created a sense of inevitability and hopelessness among Chinese and North Korean troops. The constant threat of air attacks made it difficult for them to rest, regroup, or maintain their positions. Strafing runs. Low-flying aircraft conducting strafing runs with machine guns and cannons had a terrifying effect on enemy troops. The sudden and intense firepower from the air caused panic and disrupted their ability to fight effectively. Leaflet drops. In addition to physical attacks, the USAF conducted leaflet drops to demoralize enemy troops. These leaflets contained messages urging surrender, highlighting the futility of resistance, and offering safe passage to those who laid down their arms. Impact of PSYOP on the battle. The psychological impact of air power contributed to the overall success of UN forces in the Battle of Old Baldy. Reduced enemy morale. The relentless air attacks and the constant threat of bombing and strafing runs significantly reduced the morale of Chinese and North Korean troops. This made them less willing to fight and more likely to abandon their positions. Increased surrender rates. The combination of physical attacks and psychological pressure led to an increase in the number of enemy soldiers surrendering. This reduced the overall strength of the enemy forces on Old Baldy. Disruption of command and control. The psychological stress caused by air attacks disrupted the enemy's command and control structures. Leaders found it difficult to maintain discipline and coordinate their forces effectively. Medical evacuation. Saving lives on the battlefield. The emergence of helicopter evacuation. The Korean War marked the first widespread use of helicopters for medical evacuation, medevac. Prior to this, wounded soldiers had to be transported by ground vehicles, which were often slow and vulnerable to enemy fire. Helicopters provided a faster and safer means of evacuating casualties from the battlefield, significantly improving the chances of survival for wounded troops. Medevac operations during the battle. Rapid evacuation. Helicopters, such as the H-13 Sioux and H-5 Dragonfly, were used to rapidly evacuate wounded soldiers from Old Baldy to field hospitals. This reduced the time between injury and medical treatment, increasing the likelihood of survival. Access to inaccessible areas. The rugged terrain around Old Baldy made it difficult for ground vehicles to reach wounded soldiers. Helicopters could land in confined spaces and evacuate casualties from areas that were otherwise inaccessible. Continuous evacuation. Medevac operations were conducted continuously throughout the battle, ensuring that wounded soldiers were evacuated as quickly as possible. This allowed medical personnel to focus on providing immediate care rather than organizing transportation. Impact of medevac on the battle. The use of helicopters for medical evacuation had a profound impact on the Battle of Old Baldy, improved morale, knowing that wounded soldiers could be evacuated quickly and safely boosted the morale of UN troops. This increased their willingness to engage in combat and take risks, reduced casualties. The rapid evacuation of wounded soldiers reduced the number of fatalities and improved the overall survival rate. This preserved the fighting strength of UN forces and allowed them to maintain their positions on Old Baldy. Enhanced medical care. The ability to evacuate casualties quickly allowed medical personnel to provide more effective care. This included timely surgeries, blood transfusions, and other life-saving treatments. The strategic impact of air support on the Battle of Old Baldy. Shaping the battlefield. Air support played a crucial role in shaping the battlefield during the Battle of Old Baldy. By neutralizing enemy positions, disrupting supply lines, and providing intelligence, air power allowed UN forces to gain and maintain the upper hand. The ability to call in airstrikes at critical moments turned the tide of several engagements and prevented the enemy from consolidating their gains. Enabling ground operations. Air support was essential in enabling ground operations during the battle. Close air support provided the firepower needed to overcome enemy defenses, while interdiction campaigns weakened the enemy's ability to resupply and reinforce. Reconnaissance missions provided the intelligence needed to plan and execute successful assaults. Without air support, UN forces would have faced a much more difficult and costly battle, contributing to the overall war effort. The Battle of Old Baldy was just one of many engagements during the Korean War, but it highlighted the importance of air power in modern warfare. The lessons learned from this battle influenced the development of air support tactics and strategies in subsequent conflicts. The integration of air and ground forces, the use of helicopters for medical evacuation, and the psychological impact of air power all became standard practices in military operations. The Battle of Old Baldy was a testament to the critical role that air support plays in modern warfare. From close air support and interdiction to reconnaissance and medical evacuation, air power was instrumental in shaping the outcome of the battle. The ability to project force from the air provided UN forces with a significant advantage, allowing them to overcome the challenges posed by the terrain, weather, and enemy defenses. The lessons learned from this battle continue to influence military operations today, underscoring the enduring importance of air power in achieving victory on the battlefield. The evolution of Chinese military tactics during the Battle of Old Baldy. The Battle of Old Baldy, also known as the Battle of Height 266, was a significant engagement during the Korean War. It took place between 1952 and 1953, involving the United Nations forces, primarily composed of American troops, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA. The battle was part of the larger stalemate that characterized the latter stages of the Korean War, where both sides sought to gain strategic advantages through the control of key terrain features. Old Baldy, a hill designated as Hill 266, was one such feature, offering a vantage point that could be used to observe and direct artillery fire. The Chinese military tactics during the Battle of Old Baldy evolved significantly over the course of the conflict. Initially, the Chinese relied on their traditional strengths, such as massed infantry assaults and night attacks, which had been effective in earlier stages of the Korean War. However, as the battle progressed, the Chinese adapted their tactics to counter the superior firepower and technology of the UN forces. This article will explore the evolution of Chinese military tactics during the Battle of Old Baldy, examining the factors that influenced these changes and their impact on the outcome of the battle. Background: the Korean War and the Chinese intervention. The Korean War context. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. The United Nations, led by the United States, intervened to repel the invasion, leading to a protracted conflict that lasted until an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. The war saw significant shifts in momentum, with both sides gaining and losing territory multiple times. By 1951, the war had reached a stalemate, with the front line stabilizing near the 38th parallel, the original border between North and South Korea. Both sides dug in, creating extensive networks of trenches, bunkers, and fortifications. The fighting during this period was characterized by small-scale engagements, artillery duels, and efforts to seize strategically important hills and ridges. Chinese intervention and early tactics. China entered the Korean War in October 1950, following the successful UN counteroffensive that pushed North Korean forces back to the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. The Chinese intervention, under the guise of the People's Volunteer Army, PVA, was motivated by the desire to prevent a UN-aligned state from being established on China's border and to support its communist ally, North Korea. The Chinese military at the time was primarily an infantry-based force, with limited artillery, armor, and air support. The PVA relied heavily on human wave tactics, where large numbers of infantry would assault enemy positions in an attempt to overwhelm them through sheer numbers. These tactics were effective in the early stages of the Chinese intervention, catching UN forces off guard and leading to significant territorial gains. However, as the war progressed, the limitations of these tactics became apparent. The UN forces, particularly the Americans, had superior firepower, including artillery, tanks, and air support. The Chinese suffered heavy casualties in their massed assaults, and their lack of logistical support made it difficult to sustain prolonged offensives. The Battle of Old Baldy. Initial engagements. The strategic importance of Old Baldy, or Hill 266, was a strategically important position located near the 38th parallel. The hill offered a commanding view of the surrounding terrain, making it an ideal observation post for directing artillery fire. Control of Old Baldy would allow either side to dominate the battlefield and disrupt enemy supply lines and communications. The battle for Old Baldy began in June 1952, when Chinese forces launched an assault to capture the hill from UN forces. The initial engagements were marked by intense fighting, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Chinese employed their traditional tactics of massed infantry assaults, often under the cover of darkness, to overwhelm the defenders. Chinese initial tactics. Massed infantry assaults. In the early stages of the Battle of Old Baldy, the Chinese relied on their tried and tested tactics of massed infantry assaults. These assaults were typically conducted at night, taking advantage of the Chinese soldiers' ability to move stealthily and their familiarity with night fighting. The Chinese would often infiltrate enemy positions under the cover of darkness, using the terrain to their advantage to get as close as possible before launching their attack. The massed assaults were designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. The Chinese would send wave after wave of infantry against the UN positions, with each wave attempting to breach the defenses and push the defenders back. These tactics were effective in the early stages of the battle, allowing the Chinese to capture key positions on Old Baldy. However, the massed infantry assaults came at a high cost. The UN forces, particularly the Americans, had superior firepower, including machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The Chinese suffered heavy casualties in their assaults, with entire units being decimated in the face of concentrated fire. Despite these losses, the Chinese continued to press their attacks, demonstrating their willingness to accept high casualties in pursuit of their objectives. UN countermeasures. Defensive preparations and firepower. The UN forces, recognizing the threat posed by the Chinese massed assaults, took steps to strengthen their defensive positions on Old Baldy. They constructed extensive networks of trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire obstacles to slow down and channel the Chinese attacks. The defenders also laid minefields and prepared pre-registered artillery fire to target likely avenues of approach. The UN forces' superior firepower played a crucial role in repelling the Chinese assaults. Machine guns and mortars were used to create kill zones, where advancing Chinese troops could be cut down in large numbers. Artillery fire was directed at Chinese assembly areas and supply lines, disrupting their ability to launch coordinated attacks. Despite these countermeasures, the Chinese were able to make some gains on Old Baldy, capturing key positions and forcing the UN forces to retreat. However, the high casualties suffered by the Chinese in these assaults began to take a toll on their ability to sustain the offensive. The evolution of Chinese tactics. Adaptation and innovation. The shift from massed assaults to infiltration tactics. As the Battle of Old Baldy progressed, the Chinese began to adapt their tactics in response to the challenges posed by the UN forces' superior firepower and defensive preparations. The massed infantry assaults, while initially effective, were proving too costly in terms of casualties. The Chinese leadership recognized the need to find a more sustainable approach to the battle. One of the key changes in Chinese tactics was the shift from massed assaults to infiltration tactics. Instead of launching large-scale attacks with waves of infantry, the Chinese began to focus on smaller, more flexible units that could infiltrate enemy positions and conduct hit-and-run attacks. These infiltration tactics were designed to exploit weaknesses in the UN defenses and disrupt their ability to coordinate a cohesive defense. The Chinese infiltration units, often composed of elite soldiers, would move stealthily through the terrain, using the cover of darkness and the natural features of the landscape to avoid detection. Once inside the UN positions, they would launch surprise attacks, targeting key positions such as command posts, artillery emplacements, and supply depots. These attacks were often followed by a rapid withdrawal, leaving the UN forces disorganized and unable to mount an effective counterattack. The use of tunnels and underground warfare. Another significant evolution in Chinese tactics during the Battle of Old Baldy was the use of tunnels and underground warfare. The Chinese began to dig extensive networks of tunnels beneath the battlefield, allowing them to move troops and supplies without being detected by UN forces. These tunnels also provided a means of launching surprise attacks from unexpected directions, further complicating the UN defenses. The tunnel networks were often dug deep into the hillsides, with multiple entrances and exits that allowed the Chinese to infiltrate and exfiltrate enemy positions with relative ease. The tunnels were also used to store supplies and ammunition, reducing the need for vulnerable supply lines above ground. In some cases, the Chinese would dig tunnels directly beneath UN positions, planting explosives to collapse the tunnels and destroy the enemy fortifications. The use of tunnels and underground warfare was a significant innovation in Chinese tactics, allowing them to bypass the UN forces' superior firepower and defensive preparations. The tunnels provided a means of conducting sustained operations in the face of overwhelming enemy firepower, and they played a crucial role in the Chinese efforts to maintain pressure on the UN forces. The integration of artillery and mortars. As the battle progressed, the Chinese also began to integrate artillery and mortars more effectively into their tactics. While the Chinese had always used artillery to some extent, their early efforts were often hampered by a lack of coordination and logistical support. However, as the Battle for Old Baldy continued, the Chinese improved their ability to coordinate artillery fire with infantry operations. The Chinese artillery and mortars were used to suppress UN positions, targeting machine gun nests, mortar positions, and command posts. The artillery fire was often directed at key moments during an assault, providing cover for the advancing infantry and disrupting the UN forces' ability to respond. The Chinese also used artillery to target UN supply lines and rear areas, further complicating the defenders' ability to sustain their positions. The integration of artillery and mortars into Chinese tactics was a significant development, allowing them to conduct more sophisticated and coordinated attacks. The improved use of indirect fire helped to offset some of the advantages enjoyed by the UN forces, and it played a crucial role in the Chinese efforts to maintain pressure on Old Baldy. The role of political officers and ideological motivation. Another important aspect of Chinese tactics during the Battle of Old Baldy was the role of political officers and ideological motivation. The Chinese military placed a strong emphasis on political indoctrination, with political officers embedded within units to ensure that soldiers remained committed to the communist cause. This ideological motivation was a key factor in the Chinese soldiers' willingness to endure harsh conditions and high casualties. Political officers played a crucial role in maintaining morale and discipline within Chinese units, particularly during the intense fighting on Old Baldy. They were responsible for ensuring that soldiers remained focused on the mission and were willing to make sacrifices for the greater good. The political officers also played a role in coordinating attacks, ensuring that units remained cohesive and focused on their objectives. The ideological motivation of Chinese soldiers was a significant factor in their ability to sustain the Battle for Old Baldy. Despite the high casualties and harsh conditions, Chinese soldiers remained committed to the fight, driven by a sense of duty and loyalty to the communist cause. This ideological motivation was a key factor in the Chinese ability to adapt and innovate their tactics in the face of overwhelming odds. The impact of Chinese tactical evolution on the battle. The stalemate on Old Baldy. The evolution of Chinese tactics during the Battle of Old Baldy had a significant impact on the course of the battle. The shift from massed assaults to infiltration tactics, the use of tunnels and underground warfare, and the integration of artillery and mortars all contributed to the Chinese ability to maintain pressure on the UN forces. Despite the superior firepower and defensive preparations of the UN forces, the Chinese were able to sustain their offensive and keep the battle for Old Baldy in a state of stalemate. The stalemate on Old Baldy was a microcosm of the larger stalemate that characterized the Korean War as a whole. Both sides were able to hold their ground, but neither was able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The Chinese tactics, while effective in maintaining pressure, were not sufficient to achieve a decisive victory. Similarly, the UN forces, despite their superior firepower, were unable to completely dislodge the Chinese from their positions. The human cost of the Battle of Old Baldy was marked by intense fighting and high casualties on both sides. The Chinese, in particular, suffered heavy losses as a result of their massed assaults and the UN forces' superior firepower. The shift to infiltration tactics and the use of tunnels helped to reduce casualties to some extent, but the battle remained a costly endeavor for both sides. The human cost of the battle was a significant factor in the eventual stalemate. Both sides were willing to accept high casualties in pursuit of their objectives, but the sustained losses began to take a toll on their ability to continue the fight. The Chinese, in particular, faced challenges in maintaining their offensive momentum in the face of heavy casualties and logistical difficulties. The legacy of the Battle of Old Baldy. The Battle of Old Baldy is remembered as one of the most intense and costly engagements of the Korean War. The evolution of Chinese tactics during the battle is a testament to their ability to adapt and innovate in the face of overwhelming odds. The shift from massed assaults to infiltration tactics, the use of tunnels and underground warfare, and the integration of artillery and mortars all demonstrated the Chinese military's ability to learn from their experiences and adapt their tactics to the realities of the battlefield. The battle also highlighted the challenges faced by both sides in the Korean War. The UN forces, despite their superior firepower and technology, were unable to achieve a decisive victory. The Chinese, despite their ability to adapt and innovate, were unable to overcome the advantages enjoyed by the UN forces. The stalemate on Old Baldy was a reflection of the larger stalemate that characterized the Korean War, where both sides were able to hold their ground but neither was able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The Battle of Old Baldy was a significant engagement during the Korean War, marked by intense fighting and high casualties on both sides. The evolution of Chinese military tactics during the battle is a testament to their ability to adapt and innovate in the face of overwhelming odds. The shift from massed assaults to infiltration tactics, the use of tunnels and underground warfare, and the integration of artillery and mortars all played a crucial role in the Chinese efforts to maintain pressure on the UN forces. Despite the evolution of their tactics, the Chinese were unable to achieve a decisive victory on Old Baldy. The battle ended in a stalemate, reflecting the larger stalemate that characterized the Korean War as a whole. The Battle of Old Baldy is remembered as one of the most intense and costly engagements of the war, and it serves as a reminder of the challenges faced by both sides in the conflict. The legacy of the Battle of Old Baldy is one of adaptation and innovation in the face of adversity. The Chinese military's ability to evolve their tactics during the battle is a testament to their resilience and determination. While the battle did not result in a decisive victory for either side, it remains an important chapter in the history of the Korean War and a reminder of the human cost of conflict. The long-term effects of the Battle of Old Baldy on the Korean War. The Korean War, often referred to as the Forgotten War, was a significant conflict that took place between 1950 and 1953. It was a war that not only shaped the geopolitical landscape of East Asia but also had profound implications for the global balance of power during the Cold War. Among the many battles that defined the Korean War, the Battle of Old Baldy stands out as a particularly fierce and consequential engagement. This battle, which took place over a series of skirmishes between 1952 and 1953, was fought for control of a strategically important hill known as Old Baldy, Hill 266, in the Korean peninsula's rugged terrain. The long-term effects of the Battle of Old Baldy on the Korean War and its aftermath are multifaceted, influencing military strategy, international relations, and the lives of those who fought in the conflict. This article will explore the long-term effects of the Battle of Old Baldy on the Korean War, examining its impact on military tactics, the psychological toll on soldiers, the evolution of international alliances, and the broader implications for the Cold War. By delving into these aspects, we can gain a deeper understanding of how this relatively small but intense battle contributed to the larger narrative of the Korean War and its enduring legacy. The strategic importance of Old Baldy. The geography of Old Baldy. Old Baldy, officially designated as Hill 266, is located in the central sector of the Korean peninsula, near the 38th parallel. The hill earned its nickname due to its barren, treeless summit, which made it a prominent feature in the otherwise mountainous and forested terrain. The strategic importance of Old Baldy lay in its elevation, which provided a commanding view of the surrounding area. Control of the hill allowed forces to observe enemy movements, direct artillery fire, and potentially launch offensives into enemy territory. The military significance of Old Baldy during the Korean War. The front lines were often characterized by a series of hills and ridges that served as natural fortifications. Old Baldy was one such position, and its control was highly contested by both United Nations, UN, forces, primarily composed of American and South Korean troops, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA. The hill's strategic value was not only in its tactical advantages, but also in its symbolic importance. Capturing Old Baldy was seen as a morale booster for the troops and a demonstration of military prowess. The Battle for Old Baldy. The Battle of Old Baldy was not a single engagement, but a series of skirmishes that took place between June 1952 and March 1953. The hill changed hands multiple times during this period, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The fighting was characterized by close-quarters combat, artillery barrages, and the use of trenches and bunkers. The intensity of the battle highlighted the determination of both sides to secure the hill, even at great cost. The impact on military tactics and strategy. The evolution of defensive tactics. The Battle of Old Baldy had a significant impact on the development of defensive tactics during the Korean War. The rugged terrain and the need to hold strategic positions like Old Baldy led to the refinement of defensive strategies, including the use of fortified bunkers, trenches, and barbed wire. The battle demonstrated the importance of preparing strong defensive positions to withstand enemy assaults, and the need for effective counterattacks to retake lost ground. The role of artillery and air support. Artillery and air support played a crucial role in the Battle of Old Baldy. Both sides relied heavily on artillery barrages to soften enemy positions before launching infantry assaults. The battle highlighted the importance of coordinated artillery fire and the need for accurate targeting to minimize collateral damage. Additionally, air support was used to disrupt enemy supply lines and provide close air support for ground troops. The lessons learned from Old Baldy influenced the development of combined arms tactics, where infantry, artillery, and air forces worked together to achieve military objectives. The use of night operations. The Battle of Old Baldy also saw the increased use of night operations, as both sides sought to gain the element of surprise. Night attacks allowed troops to approach enemy positions under the cover of darkness, reducing the risk of detection and increasing the chances of success. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of night operations in mountainous terrain and led to the development of specialized training and equipment for night fighting. The psychological toll on soldiers. The intensity of combat. The Battle of Old Baldy was marked by intense and prolonged combat, with soldiers on both sides experiencing the horrors of war. The close-quarters fighting, constant artillery barrages, and the ever-present threat of death took a heavy psychological toll on the troops. Many soldiers suffered from combat fatigue, shell shock, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a result of their experiences on Old Baldy. The impact on morale. The frequent changes in control of Old Baldy and the high casualty rates had a significant impact on the morale of the troops. For UN forces, the loss of the hill was often seen as a setback, while its recapture provided a temporary boost in morale. Conversely, the Chinese forces viewed the capture of Old Baldy as a symbol of their resilience and determination. The psychological impact of the battle extended beyond the front lines, affecting the families and communities of the soldiers who fought there. The legacy of trauma. The psychological trauma experienced by soldiers during the Battle of Old Baldy had long-term effects on their mental health and well-being. Many veterans struggled with the memories of the battle for years after the war, leading to issues such as depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. The battle also highlighted the need for better mental health support for soldiers, both during and after their service, the evolution of international alliances, the strengthening of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. The Battle of Old Baldy played a role in strengthening the alliance between the United States and South Korea. The shared experience of fighting together on the front lines fostered a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect between American and South Korean troops. The battle demonstrated the commitment of the United States to the defense of South Korea and helped to solidify the U.S.-South Korea alliance, which remains a cornerstone of East Asian security to this day. The role of China in the Korean War. The Battle of Old Baldy also highlighted the significant role played by China in the Korean War. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army's determination to hold Old Baldy demonstrated their commitment to supporting North Korea and resisting UN forces. The battle underscored the importance of China as a key player in the Korean War and had implications for the broader Cold War dynamics between the United States and China. The impact on international relations. The Battle of Old Baldy had broader implications for international relations during the Cold War. The conflict in Korea was seen as a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union, with China playing a crucial role on the communist side. The battle highlighted the global nature of the Cold War and the willingness of both superpowers to support their allies in regional conflicts. The lessons learned from Old Baldy influenced U.S. foreign policy and military strategy in subsequent conflicts, including the Vietnam War. The broader implications for the Cold War. The Korean War. As a Cold War conflict, the Korean War was one of the first major conflicts of the Cold War, and the Battle of Old Baldy was a microcosm of the larger struggle between the capitalist West and the communist East. The battle demonstrated the willingness of both sides to engage in prolonged and costly conflicts to achieve their geopolitical objectives. The Korean War set a precedent for future Cold War conflicts, where superpowers would support opposing sides in regional wars without directly engaging each other. 5.2 The impact on U.S. military strategy. The Battle of Old Baldy had a lasting impact on U.S. military strategy during the Cold War. The lessons learned from the battle influenced the development of U.S. military doctrine, particularly in terms of defensive tactics, combined arms operations, and the importance of air and artillery support. The battle also highlighted the need for effective intelligence and reconnaissance to anticipate enemy movements and plan counterattacks. The role of nuclear deterrence. The Korean War, including the Battle of Old Baldy, took place against the backdrop of the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The threat of nuclear escalation loomed over the conflict, influencing the strategies and decisions of both sides. The battle demonstrated the limits of conventional warfare in a nuclear age and underscored the importance of nuclear deterrence in maintaining the balance of power during the Cold War. The legacy of the Battle of Old Baldy. The memory of the battle. The Battle of Old Baldy remains a significant event in the history of the Korean War, remembered for its intensity and the sacrifices made by those who fought there. The battle is commemorated in various ways, including memorials, museums, and veterans organizations. The memory of the battle serves as a reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of honoring those who served. The impact on Korean society. The Battle of Old Baldy had a lasting impact on Korean society, particularly in South Korea. The battle is seen as a symbol of the resilience and determination of the South Korean people in the face of adversity. The experience of the Korean War, including the Battle of Old Baldy, helped to shape South Korea's national identity and its commitment to democracy and freedom. The lessons for future generations. The Battle of Old Baldy offers important lessons for future generations about the nature of war and the importance of diplomacy and conflict resolution. The battle highlights the need for effective leadership, strategic planning, and the importance of supporting the mental and physical well-being of soldiers. The lessons learned from Old Baldy continue to inform military strategy and policy, as well as the broader understanding of the complexities of war. Conclusion. The Battle of Old Baldy was a pivotal engagement in the Korean War, with long-term effects that extended far beyond the battlefield. The battle influenced military tactics and strategy, had a profound psychological impact on soldiers, shaped international alliances, and contributed to the broader dynamics of the Cold War. The legacy of the Battle of Old Baldy serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who fought in the Korean War and the enduring importance of understanding the complexities of conflict. As we reflect on the lessons of Old Baldy, we are reminded of the need for vigilance, diplomacy, and a commitment to peace in an ever-changing world.